Hey, welcome back to the Progressive Brothers podcast. This is episode 6. I'm here with my co-host, Renaissance Man.
Hey, welcome back, everyone. Please like the video and peace to everyone in the chat.
So, Biden's first 100 days. I think so far he's done a lot of work in the first 100 days. Poll ratings show that he is 2/3 approved in comparison to Trump and his first 100 days in 2017. So, what are your thoughts on that?
So far, I think he's done a pretty good job. I think, he's laid out his agenda. Obviously, he had the address to Congress last night. He's acted very quickly on things like COVID and the economy and those things. And then he's sort of laid out a vision for some of the more ambitious plans that he seeks at least to try to implement in his administration. I think the real test between now and the midterms will be how much buy-in and how much leverage he can use to get the moderates of the Kirsten Sinemas and Joe Manchins of the world to really buy into his agenda to get things passed. Like we said, he got the COVID bill passed through reconciliation. Infrastructure looks like it will be passed through that same process. And recently they've had a ruling where they'll be able to use a third reconciliation process in this Congress as well. So it'll be interesting to see what those other two processes are used for, whether it's two split infrastructure bills or they try to tackle something else.
Yeah, I think the speech that he gave last night in front of Congress, I think that was pretty stellar. It was definitely different because there was a lot of social distancing. This is something that we hadn't seen before, right? In terms of how he engaged or how a president engages the delegation. Definitely different, but I think the message was really key and really simplistic and really written in a way that it was digestible by the most common voter, so to speak. So you didn't have to have a college degree to really understand which terms and words that he was using. He was speaking really low level, right to the base itself. So I think he was trying to reach out to those on the right who may be silent leftists, so to speak, ones who can actually be influenced to actually come to the right, come to the left. And so I'm thinking about this and I'm like, people say that, he tripped up a few steps going up to the Air Force One. He forgets people's names, but I think last night he was banging on all cylinders. So I can't really find anything too terrible or enough to write him off on this one. I think the first 100 days of any president kind of gives you a gauge as to what the temperature is, for that moment, right? So if it's bad the first 100 days, probably high probability it's going to be bad, throughout the rest of the midterms too. I think 100 days are a good way to determine what the midterms are going to come, what the midterms are going to be.
Yeah. It seems very arbitrary, and a lot of emphasis is placed on the first 100 days. Like you said, it's sort of a barometer. You get the opportunity to lay out your agenda. You kind of get a temperature for the appetite as far as how willing the other side is to cooperate with you, what the general mood of the country is, what the appetite is for change, say, and what you want to basically implement and try to run on or have your party run on in 2 years in the midterms, and then what you really want to focus on post midterms and going into your second re-election campaign. Like you said, usually for most presidents, the early part of their administration, that's when they just come off an election victory. They have a lot of influence. Their approval rating tends to be relatively high. So like you said, if they aren't really successful and they get off to a sort of a choppy start, then that sort of seems to define the remainder of their term. You can look at Trump, for example, with the first big blow and first thing they really focused on was healthcare, repealing Obamacare, and that fell apart, and that was sort of the momentum that kicked off basically his 4 years. Was they struck out on healthcare, never really got a deal on infrastructure. Really, it really, and then by the time you get through all of those things, executive orders being struck down, by the time you get to the midpoint, you get Democrats back in control, and then all of a sudden your whole agenda is at jeopardy just because you've got divided government. And that was sort of the thing. You really got the Trump signature piece of his legislation was really, the tax bill that got passed, some executive orders, and then the peace treaty and normalizing of relations between, I believe it's Israel and Saudi Arabia. So, those are the two things that stand out for me with the previous administration. So it's definitely an important marker, and the president, in my opinion, has gotten some pretty nice victories. And I think the key going forward between now and the midterms will be what he can do for the economy. Stock market's obviously doing really well, but you still have a lot of people who are out of work, a lot of people who are behind on rent. So those are some things that are going to have to be addressed. As well as I saw someone like Mark Cuban was basically advocating for another stimulus. He was saying basically he wanted to give people $1,000 every 2 weeks for 2 months, with the contingency that they have to spend it within 10 days just to get the full economy jump started. Just because, like we said, Wall Street's doing well, but not so much for Main Street.
Yeah, I don't know if you can do it for 10 days, but 30 days and 45 days does seem logical in the finance world. I've never heard of a check that needs to be spent within 10 days because some people were receiving debit cards, the first stimulus, and they were throwing it away. So I can't imagine that would be sufficient. But we did see conservatives in the room on the right falling asleep. Ted Cruz, Cancun Cruz, was taking, power naps, during the speech. And the speech wasn't that long. It was only an hour. So I find it interesting that you had conservatives in the room who, one, did not stand up. Some people were, almost looked like they were having rigor mortis, just sitting around, get it over with. But they never really had a response. But let's go over some of the items that I think that Biden did well on the first 100 days. My first take is I think he handled the pandemic well. What's your take?
Yeah, I think that's one of his biggest marks, and that there's a lot that goes into that as far as the pandemic, because obviously when he got into office, that essentially sunk Trump's re-election campaign. And was a nail in his coffin for the administration was the pandemic. So, January, soon as the Biden administration came in, that was the first task is getting the pandemic under control. Various executive orders, utilizing Defense Production Act to work with Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson to get vaccines, purchasing vaccines, and then getting them distributed, utilizing I know we talked about NFL stadiums. That was one. Expanding vaccination sites for things like CVS and pharmacies, so people can get vaccinated there as well. He actually, reached his goal of 100 million vaccines 40 days ahead of schedule. And then I believe by the end of this month, he wanted to be to 200 million vaccines, which they're on pace to do as well. So did really well on that front. We recently found out, I believe today, that New York City is going to fully open in mid-July. The Biden administration has basically talked about, essentially with the rate of vaccinations, they're anticipating people to essentially not have to really socially distance or wear masks at a 4th of July cookout. So, within 6 months, he's really made progress where, Trump came up short, I believe, 20 million vaccinations by December. So he's really done well there. And then also on the COVID front, you have the executive orders that he assigned to suspend student loan payments as well as interest accrual on student loans. He's put a eviction moratorium in place to to basically stop people from being evicted who are behind on rent. We know about the American Rescue Plan Act, the COVID bill, essentially, that gave the $1,400 stimulus to everyone, as well as the, I guess this sort of is a subset under that bill, but the relief to disadvantaged farmers, Black and minority farmers for historic discrimination. You had $5 billion there that made it through the COVID bill as well. So lots of good things happened from the COVID standpoint. Lots of opportunities, lots of progress that was made. And I think that's one of the main reasons he got elected, was to handle the pandemic. And it looks like it's definitely going in the right direction. Cases are trending downward. You are seeing some spikes in some places, but that seems to be driven more by people thinking the pandemic's essentially over. It's more now just a race to get the remaining vaccinations out and get to herd immunity so we can move forward.
Yeah. 1 in 4 Republicans, or people who do vote Republican, got the vaccine, and then 3 out of 4 Democrats, or people who vote Democrat, actually got the vaccine. And so they have leftover vaccines, 30 plus million left over that they're talking about they could actually dole out to other countries, I think by the end of the summer or something like that, after they lift the curtains on the lockdown. So I find that to be very interesting. What's your next item on the list?
My next item was healthcare. One of the major things the Trump administration focused on was basically repealing Obamacare through the Supreme Court, other courts, as well as legislative action and executive orders. They essentially tried to dismantle Obamacare. The main thing I know is that I believe he signed an executive order that reopened the federal exchanges, as well as that's, Bernie Sanders went on universal health care. That doesn't seem like something that's really been talked about much, but definitely strengthening Obamacare. That seemed to be one of the things that he's focused on, as well as focused on preserving, because that's a part of his legacy, as well as the Obama administration.
Yeah, I think they're calling it Biden care now. So that is interesting too. But you still have states that are considered to be red pushing back against it. I don't think that's a big deal. But my next item to cover would be like economic policy, right? So another stimulus coming next month, possibly May. So they're talking about Biden's next step, which is human infrastructure development. And that includes a stimulus and jobs and things like that. And so another, $1.7 trillion, I think, or something like that. 1.7 trillion dollars needs to be doled out for this next one. Or maybe, I think it might be less. I think it might be something like 800 billion or something like that. And so I think that another stimulus, maybe one more stimulus after July when things open back up. I think the timing is correct. I think it's a good idea to actually push stimuluses all throughout the rest of the year, because not everyone's going back to work. And if you're going to stimulate the economy, like you said earlier, you're going to have to put out, a check that's going to be void after 30 days or after 45 days or something like that. But stimulus coming next month, human infrastructure investment. I just think that the economic policy piece within the first 100 days, I can't find anything to complain about.
I would also throw in there sort of, you could argue, a restructuring of the economy, in the sense of he essentially proposed, I believe last night he talked about free community college, low cost, maybe even free daycare for families, as well as I think permanently expanding the earned income tax credit, the actual levels that it's operating at. So you couple that with his proposals to raise the capital gains rate for people making over $1 million a year, as well as return the corporate tax rate, I believe, to the Bush era levels. So you're seeing some of that element as well in the economic policy of just sort of a restructuring of the economy. On the stimulus side, yeah, one of the things I've read is that essentially that the savings rate right now is currently the highest it's been, I want to say maybe even in history. So it, a lot of people I think got really traumatized by the pandemic, job loss, food lines, all of that. So when they're getting money, they're sitting on it. They're not going and spending it, which that's the point of a stimulus. It's to essentially, hey, these businesses, restaurants, brick and mortar stores, retail, movies, all of these industries are hurting, especially since activities in travel industry, all these activities that you really can't engage in because of the pandemic. So the whole idea behind the stimulus is to basically give these people money in hopes that they'll go and spend it and stimulate the economy. So like you said, with the next stimulus coming possibly next month, we'll see how much appetite there is from I guess the moderates really, and I don't anticipate any Republicans signing on because they didn't sign on to the last one. It'll be interesting to see, how big, who it applies to, as far as they continue to have, $1,400, $1,000. Is there the same income caps, or do you give it to everyone, or give it to an even smaller group of people? So all of that will be interesting to see. And like I said, the main thing will be that people go out and spend it. And maybe with summer coming up, people will, lots of demand for rental cars right now. I believe a lot of places are saying they're running short of rental cars because so many people are booking travel to go on vacation, just tired of being cooped up at home.
Yeah, I just, anything that can drive the economy right now is probably going to be a win for him. If we look at it from a pro-black perspective, from a black economic perspective, then this is good for black people, right? Black people who probably did not have any sort of savings before. If you only had about $400 in your savings on average, in 2020, that was gone within 2 weeks. That was gone within a month. I think this round of stimulus is going to be, a turbo boost for a lot of people within the community itself. So I see nothing wrong with the economic policy piece. A lot of pushback from the right says, oh, this is socialism. This is too much, we can't afford this. Well, I say, well, what's the alternative? The alternative is to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. All right, well, while you think that, these people are going to take that stimulus, I find it interesting that people on the right also receive the stimulus, but they're not sending it back.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Everybody's that's the sort of the conundrum right now, and is you have Trump, who, like we said, basically passed, I want to say it was a $2 trillion tax cut. These Republicans were dead silent on, the deficit and spending, and basically said it would pay for itself over the next 10 years, which I highly doubted. I believe the CBO even at the time came out and said it was going to lead to a budget shortfall. So it's very interesting to see those very same people now shifting back and saying and pretending to care about deficits and, being in opposition to all this spending when, during the Trump administration, whether it be COVID or the trade war with China, they had no problem doling out money at that point.
What's the next item on your list?
I would say foreign policy. Three things stand out. I think the most prominent one being the announcement of the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan and setting a hard date to be out of Afghanistan. This is a war that we've been in for 20 years, and you've sort of seen partisans go back and forth on, troop drawdowns, troop surges, actual dates for full withdrawal of troops and turning over power to the leadership in Afghanistan. So setting that hard date, whether you agree with it being politically sound or not, I just think the significance of it, of actually, winding down this engagement that you've been involved in for 20 years, it's just that's something of significance. I also think, by executive order, rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, that was one of the things that he did immediately upon getting into office was, Trump withdrew us from it. He basically reverse that and put us back into the Paris Climate Accord. So really showing a commitment to, hey, the world powers are really going to have to be a leader on combating climate change, and really doing something about emissions and carbon capture. So showing that commitment. And then I also resuming the talks with Iran, so possibly trying to reinstate some form of the Iran nuclear deal. We'll see, what the appetite is, what people's ideas on how they deal with Iran. I know the Trump administration pulling out of the deal and the tensions that they had with Iran, the assassination of one of their generals is obviously going to put some strain on U.S. Iranian relations, and then as well as just Middle Eastern geopolitics in general, because that tends to be the one concern of everyone in the region is a hegemonic Iran, and how the U.S. Basically acts as a check on that power. So it'll be interesting to see what the stance is, if they are able to get a deal that both sides feel that they can agree on and sort of restore what they were on the path on prior to Trump. And then in general, just on the foreign policy, just a return to some level of normalcy, engagement with the world, leadership, some form of that as well too. The Trump administration and a lot of the Trump base were very much isolationist, very much wanting to pull out of engagement of the world. And you sort of saw some of that, and you sort of saw some of the strained relations with other European allies. So just in general, being more engaged and working with our allies again, I think is a big step in the right direction.
Here's why I disagree with you, and I give Biden a D minus or a D plus, give or take. He called Putin a killer. I think that's bad for diplomacy. His unwillingness to engage Cuba, again, carrying over Trump's foreign policy on Cuba. Bad news, especially for your base in Florida. I think that's bad. And I also take how he engages Latin America on the border crisis. I think these are really big failures on his part so far. Although he did say this morning, to a crowd that was heckling him in Georgia, that he's going to get to it next week. Whether he does or not, I don't know. I think those three areas I think are really critical, especially the Russia and Ukraine issue. I think that those are really critical areas that I think he's dropping the ball on. I don't think that it's a good idea to actually have poor diplomacy with Russia at this point, and China, because in the Anchorage summit, there was a lot of shouting going back and forth between Anthony Blinken and the Chinese premier last month in Anchorage, and I think that was also a bad look for him. So first 100 days in terms of foreign policy, I think the climate change agreement that he set the standard for late 2030, or exactly 2030, but what month, what day wasn't really specified. I don't think it's going to be the first of the year. I think that's definitely something that happens long after, in the fourth quarter or something like that they can actually reach that goal completely of reducing carbon emissions down 1%. I think that's possible. I also think that's an aggressive position to take, but overall, foreign policy wise, I just think that it's a bit of a disaster to sail multiple aircraft carriers in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Straits. I also think calling Putin a killer is really, really bad look, for him. Putin responded back and said, "I wish you good health," meaning that he may think that something is going on with Biden from a dementia standpoint, but that's neither here nor there. Point of the matter here is poking your chest out to your adversaries at this point doesn't make a whole lot of sense, especially if you're talking about getting out of Afghanistan and you're cutting your tail and running. And I think the continuation in Syria, it's the same foreign policy from last two administrations. I don't think that these are good ideas. So that's my take. I think that's the only issue that I take with his first 100 days is the foreign policy piece. I really wish that he would engage Africa more instead of engaging, everyone else except for the continent. But I'll give him some time. I think he'll get around to that around the midterms.
So just for clarity, you're I guess you don't like the aggressive stance that he's taken towards China in regards to Taiwan, because there seems to be a lot of pressure to make sure we stand by them, coupled with same thing with the Ukraine, with sort of Russia's actions towards them. I guess you don't like that aggressive posture that he's made.
The foreign policy for Taiwan is one that's ambiguous, right? There's nothing written that says if anything happens to Taiwan, we have to come to their defense, and there's nothing written that says we're not standing with Taiwan. So it's kind of a hide my hand behind my back and don't know what the other one is doing. So it's one of those things. I just think that it doesn't benefit the United States to say, to bully them, to stick their chest out to China by sailing aircraft carriers through the Taiwan Straits and then calling Putin a killer, and then not really having a dedicated policy for how we deal with the Ukraine by arming them, right? We're now finding out that there are white nationals in the South who are flying to the Ukraine and fighting on the side of a group called Sloboda, which is basically a right-wing Ukrainian group that is similar to the Proud Boys in the United States and the Oath Keepers. And I think something should be done about that. I think if they go over there, I think they should, have to stay over there permanently. I think you should lose your citizenship for going over there. But that's just me. But whether or not Biden takes that on, I don't know. I don't know how he plans on engaging it. It's all really, saber rattling, something I just don't really agree with.
Okay. And then I guess now that you mentioned that as well, too, with the whole China piece, you've seen some of it with his infrastructure plan and talks of the basically push to move to EVs and really trying to build electric vehicles here in the U.S., the infrastructure, as well as clean energy. I think one area that you're going to see unity on amongst Republicans and Democrats, there may be disagreement on how they go about it, is moving the supply chain out of China for some of this U.S. manufacturing, trying to become less dependent. The other piece I think that will be interesting will be, like I said, Trump started the trade war with China, seeing what his stance is on that. I don't think they'll take the Trump administration stance of outright trade war, but when you start talking about 5G and chip manufacturing and the chip shortage that's going on right now, what's his long-term strategy going to look like to alleviate that and move forward? Because 5G is going to play a critical role in this infrastructure bill, as well as the economy and just the general modernization that seems to be the direction they're taking under this administration.
Yeah, so I think the strategy is to move a lot of that manufacturing, the chip manufacturing, back to the United States. Intel is supposed to be opening up a new manufacturing facility in Arizona. I think that's supposed to be completed by next year. Foxconn, which is another Taiwanese company, they have a facility that's supposed to be opening up in Michigan. No one really knows what's going on with that. Now, the possibility is that in the event that anything is to happen to Taiwan in the next 6 to 12 months, I don't see anything happen in the next week or so, but in the next 6 to 12 months, I think the idea is to move Taiwan's manufacturing to the United States as a safeguard so that the Chinese don't come in there and disrupt it and disrupt the global supply chain. And so from a foreign policy standpoint, that's where the ambiguity begins, right? So are you going to come to their defense militarily, or are you going to defend your economic interests? Where do we really stand on this? Because anything happens to Taiwan could actually be a major disruptor to the global supply chain too, because just because Taiwan is small on the map, they do have a lot of strategic technology interests that everyone depends upon for their desktop, mobile phones, and things of that nature. That could really be a big problem. I think that they should have thought about this back in 2016, 2017. That should have been long thought of moving a lot of your manufacturing away from China, putting it in India. Well, I don't think they'll put it in India because those countries don't recognize Taiwan as an independent state. But I think there is, some maneuverability that can be done if you start moving that manufacturing to places like Haiti, Guatemala, Nicaragua, those places. I think that there is some say so there, some leverage that can be had. But that may be too technical for this podcast. But I think that Biden they have to come up with a real clear strategy of how to recover those that supply chain resources, because anything happens to Taiwan, it's going to be a domino effect across everything else.
Okay, gotcha. I guess I'll move on to my last one, and then I'll let you throw out your remaining items. For me, it's equity. First thing that stands out to me is most diverse cabinet in U.S. history. When you look at the number of Black people who are in the cabinet, you've got I believe the head of Health and Human Services is a Black woman. You've got Lloyd Austin, who is head of DOD. I believe it's a Black man who's over the EPA. Name slips me at this point. Obviously, you've got Kamala Harris as vice president. And then you've got Cedric Richmond in a senior policy advisor role as well. Lots of women spread throughout the administration. I believe an all-female comms team. So lots of diversity there. And then and going further into the equity piece, one thing that stood out to me was he signed basically, I believe it was almost like a commission or a study. And I think it'll take about 2 months to do this study, but essentially looking at federal policy. And I think a lot of this is geared towards Black people, and then as well as historically socially disadvantaged groups, looking into just federal policy, how it's historically played a role in things like housing, unfair lending scores. I believe there's something in there as well about federal contracting, and essentially looking at all of those things and looking at how policy in these major cabinet positions and the policy that comes out of those organizations, how that can be leveraged to drive equity and in things and close things like the wealth gap, the home ownership gap, educational gap, things along those lines. So that will be interesting to see just what comes out of that commission. I know people tend to be very cynical about those things, but I think the fact that you'll have data and then that you will then have someone who is at least taken that step, I think that'll be huge for at least being armed with things to act on, so people can't really just sit up here and act like these things don't exist. Under the equity piece too as well, I don't know, and I don't think it'll get past this Congress. This is one of the things that was spoken about by Tim Scott last night, was policing reform. The Biden administration basically pivoted its stance from basically, I think the initial stance was basically towards doing a commission on just policing reform and what was necessary. And they basically pivoted and said, no, I think through CBC pressure and other activist pressure, that instead they're going to focus on getting the George Floyd Policing Reform Act passed. So whether that turns into, hey, that's something we have to try to do and see what we can pick up in the midterms and try to make that sort of a second half as administration policy, or whether they decide to come to the table and give in on Republicans and try to get a deal done. I would prefer it to be something that's pushed off if it has to be, just because I was listening to a commentator today and they thought Tim Scott could actually leverage his position and he had a lot of influence to actually get his party to move. But I just don't see it. I think if you end up signing a deal with the Republicans, you're going to end up missing out on things like qualified immunity, and as well as use of force statistics and things along like those critical things that are really going to drive change, as well as I believe things like requiring police officers to carry private insurance to cut down on some of these payouts that taxpayers are essentially stuck with.
Interesting you bring up Tim Scott, because I don't have anything else on my list, but he's on the agenda. So let's play the clip from where Tim Scott, he does his speech after Biden did his fair use.
President seems like a good man. His speech was full of good words, but President Biden promised you a specific kind of leadership. He promised to unite a nation, to lower the temperature, to govern for all Americans, no matter how we voted. This was the pitch. You just heard it again. But our nation is starving for more than empty platitudes. We need policies and progress that brings us closer together. But 3 months in, the actions of the president and his party are pulling us further and further apart. I won't waste your time with finger pointing or partisan bickering. You can get that on TV anytime you want. I want to have an honest conversation about common sense and common ground, about this feeling that our nation is sliding off its shared foundation and how we move forward together. Growing up, I never dreamed I would be standing here tonight. When I was a kid, my parents divorced. My mother, my brother, and I moved in with my grandparents. 3 of us, sharing one bedroom. I was disillusioned and angry, and I nearly failed out of school. But I was blessed. First, with a praying mama. And let me say this, to the single mothers out there who are working their tails off, working hard, trying to make the ends meet, wondering if it's worth it, you can bet it is. God bless your amazing effort on part of your kids. I was also blessed by a Chick-fil-A operator, John Moniz, and finally with a string of opportunities that are only possible here in America. This past year, I've watched COVID attack every rung of the ladder that helped me up. So many families have lost parents and grandparents too early. So many small businesses have gone under. Becoming a Christian transformed my life, but for months, too many churches were shut down. Most of all, I'm saddened that millions of kids have lost a year of learning when they could not afford to lose a single day. Locking vulnerable kids out of the classroom is locking adults out of their future. Our public schools should have reopened months ago. Other countries did. Private and religious schools did. Science has shown for months that schools are safe. But too often, powerful grown-ups set science aside, and kids like me were left behind. The clearest case I've seen for school choice in our lifetimes, because we know that education is the closest thing to magic in America. Last year, under Republican leadership, we passed 5 bipartisan COVID packages. Congress supported our schools, our hospitals, saved our economy, and funded Operation Warp Speed, delivering vaccines in record time. All 5 bills got 90 votes in the Senate. Common sense found common ground. In February, Republicans told President Biden we wanted to keep working together to finish this fight. But Democrats wanted to go it alone. They spent almost $2 trillion on a partisan bill that the White House bragged was the most liberal bill in American history. Only 1% went to vaccinations, no requirement to reopen schools promptly. COVID brought Congress together 5 times. This administration pushed us apart. Another issue that should unite us is infrastructure. Republicans support everything you think of when you think of infrastructure. Roads, bridges, ports, airports, waterways, high-speed broadband. We're in for all of that. But again, Democrats want a partisan wish list. They won't even build bridges to build bridges. less than 6% of the president's plan goes to roads and bridges. It's a liberal wish list of big government waste, plus the biggest job-killing tax hikes in a generation. Experts say when all is said and done, it would lower wages of the average American worker and shrink our economy. Tonight, we also heard about a so-called family plan, even more taxing, even more spending, to put Washington even more in the middle of your life, from the cradle to college. The beauty of the American dream is that families get to define it for themselves. We should be expanding opportunities and options for all families, not throwing money at certain issues because Democrats think they know best. Infrastructure spending that shrinks our economy is not common sense. Weakening our southern borders and creating a crisis is not compassionate. The president is also abandoning principles he's held for decades. Now he says your tax dollars should fund abortions. He's laying groundwork to pack the Supreme Court. This is not common ground.
Let me stop here, because South Carolina's infrastructure report card is a D-. A lot of money needs to be spent on basic infrastructure, just like roads and sidewalks and things like that. A lot of potholes there. They don't have full high-speed internet. So all of these sort of areas that he's saying that that Biden, is too far apart from, in actuality, when Trump was in office, the infrastructure bill didn't get passed in either. What was South Carolina's response? What was Mississippi's response? What was West Virginia's response? What was Arkansas's response? And so on and so forth. All of these red states, all of these Republicans in charge had poor infrastructure back then too. How did they respond to it? They did nothing. They sat on it. Poor drinking water, lead pipes, poor sewage and water infrastructure. That had nothing to do with Biden. That's not pushing you guys apart. What's pushing you guys apart is that you ran out of ideas. Renaissance man.
Yeah, for me, he really didn't say much in his rebuttal, in the sense of he didn't offer any policy. He started out talking about single moms and thank you and all the sacrifices. He talked about his own mother, but here he is opposing things like, minimum wage and, expanded income tax credit, low cost daycare and childcare, coupled with, he's talking about things, he goes into some of the culture wars, talking about things like abortion and, people having the right to define, their vision versus cradle to college with the government, this like that. So, going into typical talking points, but he doesn't really define what the alternative is. He just really goes into the typical talking points of, hey, regulation that he claims will destroy the economy, higher taxes, which Biden's plan only focuses on people making over $400,000 a year. Just those typical talking points, but no real policy behind any of the issues that he's talking about and how to address them, even though he talks about these vulnerable groups like he truly has an alternative for them.
Yeah, I thought the single mother statement was more of a virtue signaling, to come vote for us. It's okay. I came from a single mother, so you'll be all right if you come over here. And I'm like, I don't know, bro. There was a time in recent history, where your party called black women welfare queens. Just saying. Let's finish what he has to say.
Nowhere do we need common ground more desperately than in our discussions of race. I have experienced the pain of discrimination. I know what it feels like to be pulled over for no reason, to be followed around the store while I'm shopping.
But racism doesn't exist according to the black conservatives. What's all this race talk? Why would they follow you around the store? You're a state senator. How can this be the case, right? So I hear him say this, but I don't see anybody on his side of the aisle from the right saying, hey, we see what's going on. We feel bad for you. I don't see them. I don't see anybody on the right. Where's Rand Paul? Where's Ted Cruz? Where's Lindsey Graham? I don't see him hanging around. Where's Mitch McConnell? Renaissance.
Nah. That's sort of the conundrum. It's, he invokes that, and then on the other side, your whole party, the base of the party, you bring up race, and these people will say you're being divisive, you're dividing America. I've literally seen on, scrolling through LinkedIn, people are saying things like, I'll be happy when there's no more first, or when can we go back to just saying, hey, this person's a founder, not a female founder or a black founder, things like that. So the very acknowledgement of race on his side is just something that just turns people off, and people have this reaction to, yet he decides to invoke it in this speech. So I just find it quite ironic. Just on the side he's on, that's currently the side that's saying, George Floyd died of a drug overdose, not of a knee on his neck for 9 minutes. So it's just always guys over there, specifically black men, seem to have to do cartwheels and hula hoops around race, and being cautious not to bring it up and offend people.
Yeah, let's listen to more what he has to say.
I remember every morning at the kitchen table, my grandfather would open the newspaper and read it, I thought. But later I realized he had never learned to read it. He just wanted to set the right example. I've also experienced a different kind of intolerance. I get called Uncle Tom and the N-word by progressives.
Now let's stop right here. The progressives are not calling you, Uncle Tom and Coon and these sort of, pejoratives. It's your base that was calling people that at one point, right? I believe they called Obama a few names as well. The food stamp president. Remember Newt Gingrich? Those sort of terms were used from people on your side of the aisle. Progressives are saying, if you're going to be on that side, then at least get something done. But what you have is the complaint that is, to me, it's a false complaint, because Newt Gingrich, Ted Cruz, Donald Trump called him a Muslim. Remember, he called this guy a Muslim. So he wasn't a U.S. citizen. The birther argument, and so we can go back and forth, on this. Renaissance, what's your thoughts?
I agree with you perfectly. Like I said, it goes back to denying reality. You have to deny the racism that goes on your side while trying to, point the finger at things that you deem as either racist or racially insensitive that happens to you on the left, or that the left may do. It kind of takes me back to the whole, Joe Biden comment of, you don't vote for me, you're not black. And, all these people on the right went crazy and brought that up. But, it's like, hey, what about all the insensitive things you do say when you do have, like you said, someone black who's running? Or, like you said, the attitude towards President Obama, everything from, he wasn't born here, he's a Muslim, all sorts of things that just run the gamut of, coded language and racially charged language.
Yeah, they called the Affordable Care Act Obamacare. I mean, that should tell you something. But let's listen to whatever else that Tim Scott has to say.
By liberals. Just last week, A national newspaper suggested my family's poverty was actually privilege because a relative owned land generations before my time. Believe me, I know firsthand our healing is not finished. In 2015, after the shooting of Walter Scott, I wrote a bill to fund body cameras. Last year, after the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, I built an even bigger police reform proposal. But my Democratic colleagues blocked it. I extended an olive branch. I offered amendments, but Democrats used a filibuster to block the debate from even happening. My friends across the aisle seemed to want the issue more than they wanted a solution.
Now, if I remember correctly, it was Rand Paul who filibustered the anti-lynching bill that you, Tim Scott, and Kamala Harris, at the time senator, was working on or proposed it. So how do you explain that? The filibuster was there. Rand Paul used it. What's the complaint now, Renaissance?
Yeah. What happened with the filibuster, essentially, with Tim Scott's bill, Republicans didn't want to take his bill into conference committee, which is normally how people go and hash things out and, come to a compromise on a bill. They wanted to just have basically an open discussion on the floor on it, and that was it. And really, when you're doing that, you're really talking about not doing much to the bill and really just having, some open debate and then try to have a vote to force someone's hand. So that's why Democrats ended up filibustering is thinking, hey, like I said, critical things are missing from his bill, and there's a big divide on several issues that would not have been closed just by, having some debate and discussions on the floor. So he's trying to paint it as, hey, he came with this great bill that would have solved everything. But like I said, qualified immunity wasn't dealt with. When you start looking at, what people want to do as far as changing funding around police and, federal use of force standards, those things weren't really addressed in his bill. And that's why there is a lot of pushback there.
Let's listen some more.
But I'm still working. I'm hopeful that this will be different. When America comes together, we've made tremendous progress, but powerful forces want to pull us apart. 100 years ago, kids in classrooms were taught the color of their skin was their most important characteristic. And if they looked a certain way, they were inferior. Today, kids are being taught that the color of their skin defines them again. And if they look a certain way, they're an oppressor. From colleges to corporations to our culture, people are making money and gaining power by pretending we haven't made any progress at all, by doubling down on the divisions we've worked so hard to heal. This stuff is wrong. Hear me clearly. America is not a racist country. It's backwards to fight discrimination with different types of discrimination. And it's wrong to try to use our painful past to dishonestly shut down debates in the present. I'm an African American who's voted in the South my entire life. I take voting rights personally. Republicans support making it easier to vote and harder to cheat. And so do the voters. Big majorities of Americans support early voting, and big majorities support voter ID, including African Americans and Hispanics. Common sense makes common ground. But today, this conversation has collapsed. The state of Georgia passed a law that expands early voting, preserves no excuse mail-in voting, and despite what the president claimed, did not reduce election day hours. If you actually read this law, it's mainstream. It will be easier to vote early in Georgia than in Democrat-run New York. But the left doesn't want you to know that. They want people virtue signaling by yelling about a law they haven't even read. Fact checkers have called out the White House for misstatements. The president absurdly claims that this is worse than Jim Crow. What is going on here? I'll tell you, a Washington power grab. This misplaced outrage is supposed to justify Democrats' new sweeping bill that would take over elections for all 50 states. It would send public funds to political campaigns you disagree with and make the bipartisan Federal Elections Commission partisan. This is not about civil rights or our racial past. It's about rigging elections in the future. And no, the same filibuster that President Obama and President Biden praised when they were senators, the same filibuster that the Democrats used to kill my police reform bill last year, has not suddenly become a racist relic just because the shoe is now on the other foot. Race is not a political weapon to settle every issue the way one side wants. It's far too important. This should be a joyful springtime for our nation. This administration inherited a tide that had already turned. The coronavirus is on the run. Thanks to Operation Warp Speed and the Trump administration, our country is flooded with safe and effective vaccines. Thanks to our bipartisan work last year, job openings are rebounding. So why do we feel so divided? Anxious. A nation with so much cause for hope should not feel so heavy laden. A president who promised to bring us together should not be pushing agendas that tear us apart. The American family deserves better, and we know what better looks like. Just before COVID, we had the most inclusive economy in my lifetime, the lowest unemployment rates ever recorded for African Americans, Hispanics, and Asians, and a 70-year low nearly for women. Wages were growing faster at the bottom than at the top. The bottom 25% saw their wages go up faster than the top 25%. That happened because Republicans focused on expanding opportunity for all Americans. In addition to that, we passed opportunity zones, criminal justice reform, and permanent funding for historically Black colleges.
Let's stop right there. Now, according to the Economic Policy Institute, I'm reading right here, it says racism and economic inequality have predisposed Black workers to be most hurt by coronavirus pandemic. So this idea that Black people were thriving, during the pandemic, I'm not seeing any results of this. Are you, Renaissance Man?
No. It's funny because, I swear I've heard those talking points before of opportunity zones, lowest unemployment, criminal justice reform, permanent funding for HBCUs. I hear those talking points a lot on YouTube. But as far as the economic piece goes, no. What you really saw is you saw a continuation of the Obama economy. Unemployment for Black people started to tick up, and COVID really just was the nail in the coffin. Trump mishandled the crisis, and Black people paid for it. When you look at the disproportionate amount of Black and Hispanic workers who were first line workers, their exposure, whether it be retail, working in grocery stores, factories, essential jobs, Black people are on the front line of that. And, people suffered because of that. That coupled with, when you look at the suffering and the damage that was done to Black businesses by COVID, I believe half of Black businesses closed. So this idea that Black America did so well under the Trump administration, at best you had, a year and a half of that. And then, when COVID hit, it really, like I said, just exacerbated an employment rate that was already starting to trend upwards in the first place. So I don't see where people are getting this idea. And when you look at the disparities that were already wreaked on the community with the last economic recession, as far as the Great Recession, as far as housing and how many people lost equity in housing or lost their homes altogether, this is just another blow. So this idea that Trump was rebuilding that is just fundamentally untrue.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at Pew Research right now, and the article says Black businesses largely miss out on Opportunity Zone money. President Donald Trump says the Opportunity Zone tax break he signed into law in 2017 has created tens of thousands of jobs and is helping minority communities and Black business owners. In a tweet earlier this month, he pointed to Opportunity Zones as proof he'd done more for the Black community than any president since Abraham Lincoln. There's no way to prove that the tax break for wealthy investors who buy a stake in business or property in the zones has created jobs or helped minority business owners. The federal government doesn't collect information on projects attracting investment in the more than 8,700 zones, leaving policymakers and advocacy groups to rely on anecdotes and self-reporting. So I'm going to drop all the links to this in the description beneath the video. This is where we are right now. You have Tim Scott up here, with his tapping his shoes on, to the rhythm of the conservative movement, and doesn't really realize there's no way to verify anything that you're talking about, bruh. Let me play the last 30 seconds of this.
And universities, for the first time ever, we fought the drug epidemic, rebuilt our military, and cut taxes for working families and single moms like the one that raised me. Our best future will not come from Washington schemes or socialist dreams. It will come from you, the American people, Black, Hispanic, white, and Asian, Republican and Democrat, brave police officers in Black neighborhoods. We are not adversaries. We are family. We are all in this together, and we get to live in the greatest country on earth. The country where my grandfather in his 94 years saw his family go from cotton to Congress in one lifetime. So I am more than hopeful. I am confident that our finest hour is yet to come. Original sin is never the end of the story, not in our souls and not for our nation. The real story is always redemption. I am standing here because my mom has prayed me through some really tough times. I believe our nation has succeeded the same way because generations of Americans in their own ways have asked for grace and God has supplied it. So I will close with a word from a worship song.
So we'll end it right there. I think that Tim Scott is on an island of his own in the conservative movement. He doesn't really have a whole lot of backing support. I don't see Michael Steele dancing with him. I don't see Condoleezza Rice. Where's Kim Klatchik? Where's ABL? Where is these Black conservatives who are supposed to be, all on the same side? Renaissance man.
No, it's the conservative movement. It seems like, at least in Black Republicans, it seems like it's a constant revolving door of people who come in, try to have some influence, try to get some things done, and find their way out. I think back to, beginning of the 2000s, you had, Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell. Those two pretty much remained silent on Condoleezza Rice pretty much remained silent for the most part on politics, and Colin Powell, has pretty much started endorsing pretty much Democrats really since Obama ran. You fast forward, a Michael Steele, he becomes RNC chair. It's pretty much has a limit placed on him. He's essentially sort of ostracized from the party, is now doing the whole Lincoln Project. J.C. Watts was in there at one point. He's retired. Will Hurd, he was in Congress under Trump. He essentially said, hey, I'm done. I believe Tim Scott is going. I believe he's not going to run for re-election, or if he does, it'll be his last time. So he seems like he could possibly be on his way out. And, you have these influx of guys, a Burgess Owens, a Vernon Jones. You have someone like Herschel Walker, who they're talking about running for senator down in Georgia. So it just seems like always there's a revolving door of these people, and they can never really catch any traction, and they end up on an island like Tim Scott is.
Yeah, it's a shame. I mean, you would think in this space that Black conservatives would actually be pumping him up in terms of promotion, but they don't even mention his name. And so I'll close out by saying this. I think Biden's first 100 days, for me, he definitely gets an A, if not an A minus. Minus the foreign policy blunders I think he's had. I don't think that's going to break him for 2022. I think that, for 2024, I think that the midterms will be determined by what happens in the first 100 days. I think they're going to go pretty well throughout the rest of the year when they open up the market back again after July 1st. Any last words from Renaissance?
Yeah. I'd give him an A as well. Like I said, I think COVID's the major thing that's been the biggest successes. And I think that's the most essential thing. You can't get the economy back moving in a positive direction. You can't get full recovery. You can't get people out working fully and schools open, all of those things, unless you get the virus under control and get people vaccinated. And that's what Trump failed to do. And that's what Biden has done. I'll give the people in the audience just a quick rundown on some stats. So in the first 100 days, Biden has signed 11 bills. To give you some perspective, Trump signed 28 in his first 100 days. So new laws, Trump obviously has signed more. You could argue some of Biden's have been larger and more impactful. When you look at executive orders, Biden has signed 42. Trump signed 33. Biden has actually signed the most executive orders in his first 100 days. No other president since Roosevelt has signed more. So he's definitely taking the lead on that front. He's reversed 62 of Trump's orders. So I think that's where a lot of that large number of 42, I think that's where that comes from, as well as and what drives that big difference is undoing a lot of things like I talked about with like the Paris Climate Accord, the Muslim ban, some of these immigration policies. When you look at COVID cases, so since Biden has taken office, COVID cases have been down 73%. Like I said earlier, I believe that is really the mandate that sunk Trump and really has made Biden, really gave Biden the election win. So he's, like I said, he's definitely been successful there. 140 million Americans have been vaccinated so far. So steadily moving towards that goal of 200 million Americans to be vaccinated. One area that I think that they're going to definitely have to pick up on, this is the last one I'll throw out, is judicial nominations. So in his first 100 days, Biden's nominated and 11 judicial nominations. So they're definitely going to have to pick up that pace if they want to keep up or even come close to the 220 judges that Trump was able to confirm under his administration, which, fun fact, I believe only one of them were black. So you should see a wave, hopefully, of nominations, and hopefully there's a lot more diversity involved, which that tends to be the trend with Republicans. I'm sorry, with Democrats versus Republicans. There tends to be a lot more diversity there. So that's an area that they're sort of slow on, and depending on how the midterms go, that's going to affect how many they can really get through, assuming Democrats can maintain control of the Senate, or if it flips back to the Republicans. So like I said, so far I'd give them an A, and I think the next big sign will be how the economy recovers, and I think that'll be a big sticking point for how Democrats do in the midterms. And I think the midterms are going to be key for getting the rest of the Biden agenda passed.
All right. Like, share, and subscribe. Have a good one.